Hello, welcome to AP Environmental Science, Chapter 3. Just for your information, I've combined a little bit of Chapter 11 with this particular lecture. There's a lot of repetition in Chapter 11, so I've moved some of those parts into Chapter 3 so we can consolidate some chapters. All right, so let's begin. This is Chapter 3 with a little bit of Chapter 11. Here we go. Your central case in this chapter talks about Hawaii and what is happening to some bird species on the island. You need to read this in order to know exactly what's going on. But a little bit of information for you is humans, we've done things to the islands. We have changed habitat. We've introduced things like invasive species into their environment. And because of the things that humans have done, we have, you can say, messed things up for the native birds in Hawaii. All right, so let's continue on. Evolution. Now, evolution forms, you can say, almost like the backbone of what you need to know in this chapter. So evolution is a very important section of this chapter. And let's talk about it. First off, we need to know a little bit of the history of evolution. And when we talk about the history of evolution, we talk about this guy named Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He came in time historically just before Darwin's time, real close to the same time Darwin was around, but just before, and he came up with an idea for evolution. A lot of students wonder, why do we learn about Lamarck's ideas when Lamarck's ideas are not supported by evidence? What I tell my students is the better you understand Lamarck, the better you are going to be at picking whether something is Lamarckian, incorrect, or Darwinian, correct. So the better you know the wrong way that people think evolution is, the better you're going to be at picking the right answers on your test. All right. So let's talk about his ideas. First off, he had some ideas that we know are not supported by scientific evidence, so let's go through them. So he believed that living things arise from non-living matter, and we know that's not necessarily correct, but it's not totally wrong because non-living things like molecules or organic molecules are what living things are made out of, all right? So at least he was thinking about these concepts. He believed that life got more complex over time. His main ideas were called inheritance of acquired traits and use and disuse. So let's talk about inheritance of acquired traits. He said that if you develop something in your lifetime, you acquired it, for example. For example, you acquire a suntan. You get darker skin by being in the sun. You have acquired a suntan. He would have said then, in turn, your next generation would have inherited darker skin as a result of you developing or acquiring that particular trait. All right, so my first thing I'm going to tell you is beware of the use of the term acquire. Something you develop or get in your lifetime does not necessarily mean it's automatically going to be inherited by the next generation in that form, and then it's going to get actually bigger and better in that form, and that's what use and disuse means. Use and disuse means if you use it, something you need. If you need something, you use it, it gets bigger and stronger and better. If you disuse it or don't use it, it gets weaker and eventually it could disappear. All right. So Lamarck would have said, you got dark skin as a result of going in the sun. Wonderful. You acquired it. And then he would have said, you eventually pass it on to your babies. Your babies would be born with darker skin. And then they would realize that darker skin would protect them. And their next generation would get darker. The next generation would get darker. And eventually until they have the right skin that protects them from their environment. So Lamarck's ideas are based on need, which is not correct. They're based off of individuals evolving, which is not correct according to the correct theory of evolution. And keyword acquire, developing something in your lifetime. So beware of that word when we're talking about evolution. If you see the word acquire in there, your brain should be thinking Lamarck, and Lamarck is not supported by evidence. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Now let's talk about the correct ideas of evolution. Evolution, biological evolution. Well, populations, they change over generations, and they can eventually become different over time. All right, that's what evolution is all about. There's large-scale macro, small-scale microevolution. Macroevolution is big scale. New species, new organisms eventually will form. Microevolution is something as simple as there being more of a certain color of a particular organism. So let me give you an example. Let's say we had light and dark moths in a population, and over time, we notice that there's more dark ones present than there used to be. Well, we had microevolution happen. There was a frequency or an occurrence, a change in the frequency or change in the occurrence of the dark ones as compared to the past. So something as simple as frequency of a characteristic, less or more of a particular trait, that is also considered microevolution, or evolution in this case. According to biological evolution, individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. A group of organisms evolves, and that's what this is showing you. What is a species? A species is an organism that can mate with itself, with another species, same species, and produce fertile offspring. All right. So when they mate or interbreed, their babies also can produce babies. Horses and donkeys can mate. They can produce offspring. Their offspring is a mule. Their offspring is not fertile. That is because they are different species. And a population, group of the same species. So here's a population right here. So Darwin's theory is called natural selection. And what does that mean? Nature chooses, nature favors or selects the organisms with the best traits or the most beneficial traits for their environment. Okay. So what does this mean? What does it have to do with? Well, his whole idea was based off of some major premises. Within a group of organisms, there's differences. He calls them variations. All right. Organisms in nature, they make more babies than can survive. They over-reproduce in nature. That's a common thing that organisms do in nature, and that's what this is. Well, when there's an over-reproduction, these little guys, they're going to compete with each other for resources, food, space, water, mom's attention, you name it. They're competing for it, all right? Because of this competition, there's a struggle to survive, all right? And Darwin's idea is all based off of differential reproduction. What does that mean? Some of these babies will be strong enough or have the right characteristics that allow them to survive. Not only survival is important, they need to survive long enough in order to reproduce. Okay, so a good example is if you go into a snowy environment, you'll notice a lot of the animals in a snowy environment are white, furry animals. Why is that? Well, that is the case because organisms that were white were better able to survive in the snow. They can camouflage and hide better. And they were also, since they were able to survive, they were able to live long enough to reproduce and make babies. So over time, the population starts looking more white and more white and more white. And why does it keep getting more white? Because the darker ones start to die off in a sense. They have a harder time of surviving. So the population over time begins to look like the survivors. And that's what happens there. Here's a picture showing you. Light trees, light moths are camouflaged, but then the environment and dark moths are easy to see. So birds that eat these moths will eat more dark ones because they're easier to find. Well, if the environment changes and gets darker in color, the background of the trees gets covered with soot or ash or something of that nature, gets darker. Now the darker moths are more camouflaged. They are harder to find, so birds will now eat the lighter ones. Over time, after things change, you'll notice more dark moths present because the dark moths had a better chance of surviving. Therefore, they were able to reproduce. This idea is Charles Darwin's idea. Another gentleman by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, he was also talking about evolution and these concepts in that same time frame. So they were proposed independently by each other, meaning they both came up with their own ideas, but their ideas were based on true logic. Evolution is not about need. That's Lamarck. Evolution is not about changing to fit in. That is Lamarck. Evolution is about nature choosing who is the best, who has the best characteristics that allow them to fit in. That's really what it comes down to. And according to Darwin, natural selection is selecting the most favorable characteristics, and then those organisms reproduce, and then the population tends to have those favorable characteristics. Those favorable characteristics are called adaptations. Okay. Mutations. Well, how do we get all the different characteristics of organisms? Well, they come about due to random changes in DNA called mutations. So how do the variations that Darwin talked about come about? Random changes in DNA is really how they came about. Darwin did not know about mutations. This is modern science adding to the theory of evolution. Another way of creating variety in an organism is through sexual reproduction. Organisms that sexually reproduce, they mix DNA from two sources and it gets shuffled around, and that is another way of creating genetic variety. Two types of evolution here. One is called divergent, one is called convergent. And let me explain to you what they mean. Divergent evolution, what does it have to do with? Well, when two species are very closely related, okay, So when two species are very closely related, and now we separate them, we put them in different environments. So now we say those different environments have different selective pressure. They're selecting for different characteristics. Over time, if we separate two organisms, put them in different environments, they will begin to, over many generations, they will start evolving different adaptations due to the environment that they have now been put into. So divergent means organisms become more different over time due to the different selective pressure in their different environments. So similar species becoming more different. That's divergent evolution. Convergent evolution would be different species evolving characteristics that are similar to each other. So a good example that I like to give people is like whales and dolphins are mammals. Let's just do dolphins compared to fish. Dolphins and fish, people would think are very closely related to each other, yet they're extremely different. A dolphin is more closely related to you and me than it is to a fish, but most people or kids would think dolphins and fish are very closely related because they both live in the ocean. Well, if they both live in the ocean, they have similar selective pressures, like being able to swim well works really great when you're in the water. So the ocean decides that better swimmers have a better chance of surviving. So convergent evolution is when different, unrelated species live in similar environments, and over time, they start developing similar adaptations like fins and flippers that allow fish and dolphins to survive in the water. Okay, so convergent means things that are different are converging and becoming more similar. Divergent, things that are similar are becoming more different. Artificial selection is what humans do. We decide which dogs get to breed with each other or which plants are mated with each other so that we can select certain characteristics in the offspring. And this is very common with dogs and purebreds and things of that sort. Biodiversity, this is the differences of life on our planet. And biodiversity is very important, especially for environmental science. The more we preserve biodiversity, the better it is for humans on our planet. Life on our planet, biodiversity, does a lot of things for us and does jobs for us that are free, that we would not get for free if things were not alive. We'll talk about that in another chapter. They're called ecosystem services. Species diversity, the differences within an organism, within one species. We are going to do a lab in class that deals with species richness, okay, the number of species in area. We're going to talk about abundance, how much organisms or species differ from each other, and the numbers of individuals in a particular area. We're going to do a laboratory on these concepts. Genetic diversity is the DNA, the gene pool. How different is it? It's very important to have variety in a gene pool because variety in a gene pool keeps a species alive when things in the environment change. Inbreeding depression is what happens when organisms, their gene pool is smaller and limited. Therefore, there's less variety. Nature has less to choose from, and therefore the species could potentially die off due to inbreeding depression. Biodiversity on our planet, where do we have the most biodiversity? It's at the equator, 0 degrees latitude. As you go north or south from the equator, you have what's called a latitudinal gradient in species richness. Species richness goes down as you go away from the equator. So as someone goes north or south of the equator towards the poles, there's less species richness. Why? There's less solar radiation, there's less photosynthesis, there's less food, and where there's less food, there's less organisms. That's just pretty much how it works. When you go to areas where it's colder, less food, less organisms, less species richness. If we were talking about species, the difference in species amongst animals, insects dominate the biodiversity of the animal kingdom, basically, in case you're wondering. Now, where do we have more diversity? We have diversity in areas where you have really diverse habitats, like a forest where you have the canopy, the leaves, the tree trunk, the ground, the foliage, the soil. There's a lot of habitat in a forest for organisms to live. So you have a lot of biodiversity. You also have biodiversity in areas that are called ecotones. Ecotones are transition areas between two major areas. Like we live in an area that has a chaparral biome, and right next to us is a desert biome. And between the two is called an ecotone, and an ecotone will have more diversity because you have organisms that would live in a chaparral area, you have organisms that would live in a desert biome, and they're all kind of in the same area in an ecotone. Speciation, this is due to those mutations we talked about earlier. You can have a new species form. So how do they generally happen? You start with one giant population, a single population, and geographic isolation takes place. They get two populations, one population gets separated or broken into half, you could say. So now you have two populations. Over many generations, mutations, isolation, these species eventually can diverge and become completely different from each other. Completely new species could form. All right, it's called allopatric speciation. Phylogenetic trees, these are also known as evolutionary trees. How do you read them? They have information on them, and that information tells you what happens after that branch. For example, jaws comes at this point. So whatever happened before jaws, lampreys do not have a jaw. Lungs or swim bladder showed up here. Whatever happened before that, they do not have lungs or swim bladder. Four legs came here, and everything after that point had four legs, and so on and so forth. So these give you an idea of characteristics that appeared on an evolutionary tree, or in this case, a phylogenetic tree, same thing. What people do, what scientists do, there's taxonomists, and they classify. It's called taxonomy, the classification of biology. Real common ones, I'll give you the order. Domain, there's two domains, eukarya and prokarya. So bacteria or eukaryotes, and we are eukarya. The rest of them, kingdom, phylum, class, order, phylum, genus, species. How do I remember them? Kids playing catch on freeways get smashed. It helps me remember the order. It makes it easier for me. So kids playing catch on freeways get smashed. Big to small classification. We are going to stop there.